Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching work by Historia Civilis. Now, Historia Civilis recently released a new video, we reacted to it, it was fantastic, and while watching it I was reminded we never did his video on work. It was released early into my master's degree, I was super busy, I sort of skipped over it and then never ended up coming back. Well, today we're gonna be watching it. Now, I don't know exactly what this video is about, aside from the topic of work, but I've heard that it doesn't necessarily fit into his modern European history series, so I'm curious to find out what we're going to learn with this one. Now, before we get into it, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction. One of capitalism's most durable myths is that it has reduced human toil. Interesting quote to start with.
We work too much.
True.
This is a pretty recent phenomenon, and so this fact makes us unusual historically. It puts us out of step with our ancestors. It puts us out of step with nature. For reasons that will become obvious, anthropologists in the 20th century became very interested in the evolution of work. And so to answer some of their questions, they looked back to Stone Age societies.
Okay, so looks like we're looking at the evolution of work, labor over time. Interesting.
What they discovered surprised them. They found that while there were unique cultural variations all over the world, virtually all Stone Age people liked to work an average of 4 to 6 hours per day.
Nice.
They also found that most Stone Age people liked to work in bursts, with one fast day followed by one slow day. Usually something like 8 hours of work, then 2 hours of work.
Well, you know, we go to work today, say you work sort of a normal 9-to-5 job, right? That's regimented, same hours, usually every day. You go in, do your 8 hours, leave, come back the next day, right? It's all very orderly. But that's only because this is the current system we live under. And that's not necessarily natural to humans, right? Humans like a bit of variation. We do things differently at different times. So it sort of makes sense to me in a more natural environment that you're going to work, like he says, in bursts, right? Some days you're going to work a lot, some days a little. It depends on the task at hand, your energy levels, you know, the circumstances, right? There's a whole bunch of factors that are going to mean that sometimes you should work more and sometimes you should work less. And that might average out over time, but it's very different than how we work today, right? That 8 hours every day you go into work, it doesn't necessarily correspond, I think, with our sort of natural way of accomplishing tasks. But of course, we live in a very different world, very different economic system than they did back in the Stone Age.
8, then 2. Fast, slow. Fast, slow. These anthropologists found another thing. Pre-capitalist and pre-industrial societies all had their own ways of measuring chunks of time. Some would measure by how long it took to accomplish a specific task, or cook a specific meal, or walk a specific distance.
Right.
But the odd thing is that when you compare all of these little markers that were used by different cultures, they were all somewhere in the ballpark of 30 minutes. It seems that in a world without clocks, or phones, or sundials, measuring the day in 30-minute chunks just feels good and natural to humans. Very few societies ever felt the need to break the day into smaller chunks than that.
I feel that. You sort of imagine some sort of vague task. You know, there's a variety. I feel like 30 minutes, that's a good chunk of time to go and accomplish something.
It's hard to go much deeper than that from archaeological evidence alone. But there are other pre-capitalist and pre-industrial societies that we can look back to help us. There are excellent surviving records from medieval Europe that delve into this issue, so let's start there.
Whoa, colorful.
For virtually all of human history, Most work has been agricultural work. This was also true of medieval Europe.
Right, and this might also contribute to some of that working in bursts, right? Because whether by day or with agricultural work, especially by season, some times of the year are going to require a lot more work than other times. So it sort of matches up. And maybe, it's not a natural human inclination to work in bursts, right? Maybe we've actually learned this from agriculture. I don't know. I'm not a scientist, all right? But whatever it is, the two sort of line up where, you have a varied amount of work depending on the day, depending on the month, depending on the time of year, right? That's sort of how agriculture works.
So when thinking about medieval workers, we shouldn't be thinking about cities. We should be thinking about workers in fields. For the first hour or so of the medieval workday, people would just trickle in at their own pace. The employer was usually expected to provide some food to the workers. So for this time, people usually had a chat and a bite to eat, but otherwise did nothing.
I will say, this is all very dependent on when we're talking about and what context, and so it seems we're talking about sort of medieval European farm labor. Once again, that's going to depend on the country, the exact time. It's worth remembering that a lot of the people doing that farm labor would have been serfs. It seems like we might be talking more about like hired hands, though I'm not entirely sure. There was a lot of work done that was uncompensated. Although we haven't talked about pay, so I guess I don't know which we're talking about in this instance. I'm just pointing out, depending on the circumstance, there will be a lot of sort of variation in how work is done, how people are treated, how people are or are not compensated, all that sort of stuff.
As you can imagine, convincing people to get up and start the work for the day was often quite difficult. Employers complained about it all the time. After a couple of hours in the field, there would usually be a mid-morning break that could range from 30 to 60 minutes, where workers would have another bite to eat. When the sun was high in the sky and the day was starting to get hot, work would stop again for an extended period of time. Something like 2, maybe even 3 hours.
Hey, you've got your sort of siesta today, your midday nap in some Mediterranean countries where some people, not all, but there's still a culture of taking sort of a midday break for what we'd see as an extended period of time. And once again, this workday is formed around the contours of agriculture, right? Agriculture is difficult, backbreaking work, both then and today. You've got a lot of farm laborers out in the field today. That's difficult work. Though I think probably a lot of those farm laborers work more strenuous hours now than they did then. But farm labor, that's a difficult task. Strenuous, weather can make it very difficult. And so you have things like the sun rises, it's the hottest part of the day, you might take a break because it's simply not feasible to work under those conditions, right? So once again, we see how the workday, the hours, the breaks, the work, it's all sort of centered around this pragmatic consideration of how best to accomplish this farm labor, or even what the workers are willing to do. You know what I mean?
Depending on how hot it was that day. This period would begin with a larger midday meal that would be recognizable to us as lunch, and was followed up by, this is not a joke, nap time.
Yeah, siesta.
In medieval Europe, siestas weren't just a Spanish thing, they were an everywhere thing. After returning to work, refreshed and rejuvenated, workers would intensify the pace of their work in an effort to finish everything up for the day. If they were done by the mid-afternoon, they could go home. If they weren't, they would break for another 30 to 60 minutes, with more food provided before.
Right, so you also notice a difference in that, at least the way this is being described in this particular circumstance, this is very task-based, right? Finish this task or goal, and then you get to go home. Whereas work today is not necessarily task-based, it's time-based, right? Come in for your 8 hours. In a lot of jobs, frankly, it doesn't matter what you do or don't accomplish. We've got a lot of white-collar office jobs today where people sort of sit around sending emails, and they're accomplishing something, But I think a lot of office workers will tell you that a lot of their day is spent not doing so much. And so that's not a task-based job. That's an hours-based job.
Or going back in for one last sprint. Most of the time, workers didn't have to stay much later than this. But if it was harvest season and people were working late, there would often be a larger break in the evening with a larger meal provided by the employer. But this was rare. Workers might be in the field for like 8 hours a day. But when you account for all of the breaks, they would only be working for 4 to 6 of those hours. During the busiest times of year, they might be in the fields for like 12 hours a day. But with the breaks, they would only be working for 7 to 9 of those hours. Notice the numbers we're playing with here. Stone Age peoples all over the world, and agricultural workers in medieval Europe.
Right, and we're also seeing a degree of variation here, right? In part due to the nature of the work.
Both liked to work 4 to 6 hours a day, even though each group had no knowledge or memory of each other. It seems that this is just a natural pattern that humans like.
Well, I mean, that's a big conclusion to draw. I don't necessarily know if that's true. Like that's a massive conclusion. But I mean, I see what he's getting at.
Medieval workers would work longer during the harvest or during a crisis, but they didn't like to, and that's the point.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe an easier point to make than what are humans' natural working inclinations. That's a big point to prove, but I do think it's fair to say what I have been saying, which is today, in a lot of our economies around the world, it's sort of time-based. You go in for your 8 hours, versus there used to be a lot more variation, right, in how many hours you would work on different days, different times of the year. It was in part due to the tasks you had to accomplish, the weather, what job you were doing. So I do think there used to be a lot more variation, right? One day might be more, one day might be less, that sort of thing.
Also notice the length of these breaks. Medieval workers measured the days in 30-minute chunks, just like their Stone Age ancestors. What else sticks out in the medieval workday? Notice how the workers were constantly eating.
Right, yeah.
This was one of the perks of being a day laborer. Food
So it does seem like we're talking about paid day laborers, which is good to know. That's kind of what I assumed. But like I said, remember, there were a lot of different kinds of workers at this time, right? I mean, you've got a lot of peasants who own their own property, peasants who are working on the property of a lord, serfs. And once again, there's sort of different degrees of this, right? You're a serf, how much autonomy do you have? How much free work do you have to do for your local lord? All this sort of stuff. But there's a lot of different ways to work, whereas, there are a lot of different ways to work today, right? Especially around the world. There is a lot of very low-paid work, some essentially close to unpaid work that you still might compare to serfdom, indentured servitude, or slavery, right? We still have slavery in many places around the world. But I would say in a lot of countries, especially more developed countries, we do run on this capitalist system of paid labor, and that tends to be by far the most common way that people work. So once again, it's sort of been ordered and regimented versus there was sort of more variation in the past. So, it's interesting comparing these different styles of work. There are these sort of key differences, but there are some things you can compare.
The workers' biggest expense, and so part of their compensation was that their employer would take care of the food for that day. It would be like if part of your compensation was that your boss paid your rent. It relieved a massive financial burden.
Some workplaces pay for their employees' food today, but a lot don't.
Other thing to note was that work was generally understood to be a thing that happened during the day, and although there wasn't an exact science to this, a workday was broadly understood to be half of daylight hours. If there was an urgent need for people to literally work from sunrise to sunset, there was kind of a gentleman's agreement that this would count as 2 days of labor.
Right, and this Now remember, like I said, this is sort of due to the practical conditions people were working in, which is you're doing farm labor. It's very difficult to do when you don't have light, right? You don't have a lot of ways of lighting up a big field. You know what I mean? And so when the days are shorter, that essentially means your work hours are shorter. The days are longer, right? It's light longer. You're probably going to be working longer. So once again, it's sort of the practical consideration. Today, it doesn't matter if it's light or dark out, or how light it stays, how late. I'm still going to work for the same time.
What can we take away from all this? Work used to be a lot more informal and a lot more casual. Labor and leisure used to be intermingled.
Right. And I think, it's kind of challenging to compare just broad work over time. That's a massive category. But I think you could compare something like this sort of paid farm labor in some places in medieval Europe to, you could imagine, paid farm labor today. And thinking of paid farm labor in the United States, a lot of which is done by undocumented immigrants, that's extremely difficult, backbreaking work. I don't know the exact schedule, but I'm pretty sure they work for longer hours than has been discussed here, and they do not get the amount of breaks. And, so that, if you compare those two, that's a sort of more direct comparison between two similar styles of work. And that sort of work is still very challenging today. And I think for a lot of farm laborers today, it's even more hours and even more work than you might have seen at this time a couple hundred years ago.
One was expected to relax and even nap on the job. Work was a part of a worker's life. Kicking back and passing the time wasn't just something workers did at home, it was equally something they did at work. Unless there was some sort of unusual crisis, workers were not expected to experience great stress while working. The week always began at a leisurely pace. Monday and Tuesday are described as days with a holiday spirit. Employers write of their difficulty in getting people to even show up.
That's funny.
Thursday and Friday are described as fast days. Mondays and Tuesdays were slow, Thursdays and Fridays were fast. An echo of the Stone Age pattern of working. Fast, slow, fast, slow. Saturday was payday, and so it functioned as a hurry up and finish everything so that we can get the hell out of here day. It seems that under normal circumstances, Saturday was kind of a half day, although during busy seasons it could easily turn into another fast day, like Thursday and Friday. After the week's work was done and everybody got paid, workers got a full day off on Sunday. But by the 16th and 17th centuries, a new custom invented by workers disrupted this pattern.
Okay.
They called it Saint Monday.
Ooh.
Saint Monday was kind of an unofficial holiday, where absenteeism was permitted and even expected on the first day of the work week. People were still flush with cash from last Saturday, and Monday was a slow day anyways, so it just organically became a thing that workers just didn't show up. Employers learned to tolerate it, and workers gleefully looked forward to it. Countless labor actions in early modern Europe can be traced back to some dumbass boss with something to prove, trying to crack down on their beloved Saint Monday.
That's funny. Well, today, and in the sort of industrial era, or maybe we're in a post-industrial era now, but modern era, we've got unions, right? Unions advocate for their workers, and, depends on where you are. In the U.S., we have a very low rate of unionization, so very weak labor power. Some places it's more strong. But, of course, we're talking about a pre-union era, pre-anything we'd recognize as a union. But that doesn't mean that workers never advocated for themselves, right? You can look at, frankly, many peasants' revolts throughout history. A lot of those were peasants who felt they were getting shortchanged for many particular reasons. Work, price of food, what they had accessible to them, taxes, whatever. Sometimes more or less political. and sometimes more sort of, I think often a lot more economic in nature, and even less than a peasant's revolt, right? I mean, that's sort of a grand thing. But you could imagine something more akin to sort of a modern strike, right? Like people take things into their own hands, or I imagine there's probably a lot of peasants ganging up and just threatening the landlord, right? That was probably an effective tactic at times as well. So you had what we'd sort of see as labor action in a different, but in some ways sort of similar form.
This was the real origin of the 2-day weekend.
Oh,
it
wow.
didn't come from government. It came from workers. They just did it themselves. And it came centuries before any legislature got around to making it official.
Well, I mean, it's also true that even the modern weekend, I suppose he's saying this is the origin of the 2-day weekend. I don't know how much you can trace that back, but that may be true. It is also true that sort of the modern weekend that we have today is only here because workers and unions pushed to have those 2 days off, right? A lot of these advancements, like the 8-hour workday, weekends, a lot of holidays, time off, stuff like that, in the end, it may have been legislated by the government, but we only get there because unions band together and fight for those sorts of things for their workers. So, we have a similar sort of story of labor action.
But leaving aside St. Monday, it's striking how different the mentality of medieval workers was from the mentality of workers today. Or let's flip that around. It's striking how different our mentality is today from that of our ancestors, going back hundreds, even thousands of years.
Yeah, I do think it is a bit of a tough comparison, comparing a lot of our modern white-collar or service work to agricultural work, right? Because there's obviously a gap in the type of work. But I think he can make his point by comparing farm labor of that era to modern farm labor, and you could actually make the same point that he's trying to make, which is very different styles of work. I was putting that out earlier with sort of modern-day farm labor in the United States. I think his point could stand with that more sort of targeted, apt comparison. But, I mean, I see what he's getting at.
Here's one specific example of that difference. Whenever medieval workers could afford to stop working, they did. Medieval Europe was not a culture in which people saved a lot of money. This isn't because they were primitive or selfish or anything like that. There just wasn't that much for poor people to spend their money on. Food, housing, clothing, that was pretty much it.
Right, and that's a big difference in sort of economy and culture as well, that, today, if you're like, yeah, I work only as much as I need to pay everything I need to pay, people are going to look at you funny. Like, what do you mean? Like, you work, you pay your bills, you save up, etc., etc. But this is an era when that's not the case, right? People will work, earn money, spend all that money, and then go back to work when they need more money. He talked about that St. Monday, how people still had cash from the week before, right? That is a little different. That's not really how it works today, right? That's because they'd have cash, they'd spend it all, and only then would they go back to work. Especially today we have salaried positions and all this sort of stuff. It's different. But there's also this difference in sort of culture, I guess, which has been brought on by a change in economy and organization of the economy.
If a worker was all set in those three categories, there honestly wasn't that much else available to them. This led to a phenomenon in medieval Europe where, after all of a worker's basic needs were met, the more they earned, the less they worked.
Right, because also think about, what is this peasant going to spend their money on? You know what I mean? This is a world where, you were talking about sort of medieval Europe. Before, we're most likely talking about prior to, say the discovery of the Americas, the explosion in trade, the sort of entrance of global capitalism onto the scene. I make that point because, one, there's no luxuries or extra things to spend their money on, right? These are people who would make things or rarely buy things they needed, and those things would last them for a long time. Apart from maybe sort of daily or weekly essentials, there wasn't a lot they could spend their money on. Right, this changes as we head into the 16, 17, 1800s with more manufacturing and more trade and access to the American colonies, throughout the Americas. And you have all these goods like sugar coming back and making all these luxury items that people want, and therefore you have things to spend your money on, right? So there's that in terms of consumerism. Right, there's just not a lot of consumerism in this portrait of medieval Europe that's being painted. That consumerism would massively rise in the next couple hundred years. And then also think of so people spend a lot of their money today on consumerism. Then there's also the question of social mobility. People might want to save their money to, maybe buy a house or upgrade their home or buy a new car or something like that. Some things that are sort of in some ways associated with sort of moving up, though it's also tied to consumerism. You think about your medieval peasant. What are they saving up to buy? There's no social mobility. They're probably stuck to the land they're on. Depending on where they are, that might be illegal. They're literally not allowed to leave. They can't buy new property. They can't. Well, what are they saving for, right? It seems today. I think sometimes people look back and they're like, "Wow, that's." I don't know what you'd say, but they just spent all their money? That's crazy. It's not really. If you think about how their life was, it's for what are they saving money? Yeah, there are some cases, some things, some types of people who this is different for, but we're sort of talking about your average medieval peasant or in some case serf or whatever. It just wasn't really a part of their life.
To put it another way, medieval workers liked to spend most of their discretionary income on leisure. This isn't such a strange phenomenon. If you survey people today and offer them a choice between more money and more time off, most people would take more time off. It's just that under our system, people are never offered that choice. Or when they try to exercise that choice for themselves, they are either professionally punished or fired. In medieval Europe, people could make that choice for themselves. And whenever possible, workers worked less. A lot less. There were 3 major holiday periods where workers routinely took a big chunk of time off. Easter, Midsummer, and Christmas. Or for the uninitiated, March or April, late June, and late December. I would note that of the 3, only the December holiday period made it into the modern era intact. Things really slowed down in the winter. Days were short, and the work was short.
Right.
Because of this, a tradition evolved called winter wages, where workers were paid half a day's wage for half a day's work.
Okay.
We're talking about a 4-hour workday at the very most. If you add in all the breaks, this would be maybe 2 to 3 hours of actual work.
You're a peasant living in medieval Europe. Winter is a tough time, right? You're not getting the work you usually do. You have wages reduced. It's cold. You probably don't have enough food, right? You were trying to make it through the winter. We talk about famines or a shortage of food, right? This is when that is most likely to be a big problem.
Winter wages were usually done for the months of December and January, and during this time, people took as much time off as they could afford. Workers spent their extra time on indoor labor that might not generate a profit. Home repairs,
right.
Building new furniture, patching up or making new clothing. These were jobs best saved for the slow winter months.
And also, remember, this is a sort of pre-consumerist, pre-capitalist era where a lot of things today that you would pay someone to do, right? You'd engage with the market. You would just do yourself. Repairs, furniture, clothing, all this sort of stuff that you would buy today or hire someone or whatever, people would do themselves, right? And you have this transition where all this is sort of the internal household economy. Over time, some of these become sort of cottage industries as markets start to arise. So people will start to, sew clothing in their home and maybe sell it, out to an external market. And then the next step is sort of the centralization of that into something like a factory, right? So we've gone from there was essentially no or very little market here to there is a market for selling and buying, but it's still people doing, the traditional way of doing things in the home and selling it out. Then we gathered everyone together into a big factory to industrialize this process, right? So we're talking about this time, we're at the very, far end of that process where people are doing a lot of this stuff on their own. They don't necessarily need to engage with a market to do so.
When you total up the estimated number of days worked by medieval farm laborers, things become quite stark. Researchers have found that Spanish farm laborers did not work for 42% of days in a year.
Wow.
In France, the number was more like 49%.
Damn!
The English usually worked more. But this
Okay,
wasn't because
the industrious English.
they were naturally more industrious.
Oh, never mind.
It's because they were historically more exploited by their aristocracy.
Right.
When there was a labor
L.
shortage in the 14th century, English laborers immediately used their clout to create more time off for themselves. For a time, English workers enjoyed 51% of days free from work.
Well, I'm sure we saw a change with the arrival of the Black Death in Europe, right? That's just sort of a massive moment in European history. We're talking about sort of right in the middle of the medieval era. And it's a time, I think we're like 13, 14 hundos, 13 especially. It's a time when you go from a peasantry that is extremely exploited, a lot of whom are serfs. You have the Black Death, that wipes out a lot of the labor supply, and a lot of peasants take this as an opportunity to essentially advocate for themselves, right? There's a shortage of labor, they have more leverage, and so the Black Death, along with, bringing a lot of upheaval in a lot of societies and killing a lot of people, for those peasants who remained, it did allow them to get a little more leverage with their boss or their landlord or their master or whomever, and perhaps allow them to take more land or move or, whatever. So I imagine, some of these numbers will be different depending on when you look and how it relates to that event in particular.
The funny thing about these numbers, 42%, 49%, 51%, is that once again, they echo how people worked in Stone Age societies. Almost every other day off. Fast, slow. Fast, slow.
I think some of this is due to that agricultural labor, and we still see some remnants of this today. For example, kids will go to school, but they'll have a summer break. And I know especially in the United States, that's a very long summer break, right? The purpose of that originally, well, to my understanding, this might not be entirely true, but to my understanding, the purpose was to work around farm labor, right? So kids could go home and work on the farm and such. And that's a remnant that we still have today, right? We still have long summer breaks, even though the vast majority of children going to school, at least in America, they don't live on farms anymore.
Labor historian E.P. Thompson describes this work pattern as a natural...
Very well-respected historian here. I've seen Historia Civilis. He's got a real thing for these 20th century British Marxist historians. Hobsbawm, E.P. Thompson. But these are very well-known and respected historians.
human rhythm.
And labor historians. Largely, though. They did a lot.
And a common preference in people across different regions, different cultures, and different times.
Yeah, once again, I don't love the word natural, and you can see Thompson's put it in quotations, I think fairly, because whenever we talk about what is natural for humans, I think we get into difficult territory. It's really hard to prove anything like that. But I think you could make the point, and I think this is a fair one, that as we look throughout human history, and look at lots of examples of labor, you probably will find a work pattern of intense labor and idleness, right? More variety than we see today. So I don't love the word natural, but I think that's probably why he puts it in quotes. I would say just looking at human history, this is a common pattern of labor, a frequent pattern of labor.
For a point of comparison, consider a modern worker working 5 days a week. In a calendar year, that worker has 28% of days off. Add in the 10 or so public holidays that most countries have, and that worker now has 31% of days off. Add in 2 weeks of vacation, and that worker now has 34% of days
Yeah, if you're even getting 2 weeks.
off. Assume instead that they get 6 weeks of vacation, and that worker has 39%
Nice.
of days off. In order for a modern worker to even begin to rival the amount of time off enjoyed by a medieval French farm laborer, that modern worker would need to be provided with 3.5 months of vacation per year.
Damn.
Plus weekends.
I mean, it's like an extended summer break you'd need to get, but for an employee.
Plus public holidays. Medieval workers were operating on a level so far beyond us that it's difficult to even dream that big.
And I will say, because I know people are going to respond by saying what I've said, which is the labor is very different between, a medieval farm labor and a lot of modern labor. That's true, right? I do think that, like I said, say you have an office job, that's definitely less intensive than being out there in the field. But to be fair, because I've made this point, I think a lot of people are going to say that. I don't think Historia Civilis is saying, man, they had it so easy back in the day, right? That's a silly point to make. I think he's just pointing out the discrepancy in how we work over time and how we work in this modern, industrial era is very different than how we've done it at any time throughout history, right? I don't think, I think that's sort of what he's pointing out, which I think is a fair and true thing to point out.
Up until the modern era, workers were paid by the day. The length of the workday could fluctuate throughout the year. But even during the busiest periods, workers might be in the fields for 12 hours at most. But as I've said, if you take into account...
And that also contributes to the, spending all your money. You're paid by the day, you spend all your money, you go to work the next day and get more money. You know what I mean? I get paid every 2 weeks. If I spend all my money, one day after work, I'm not getting paid the next day, right? So that also, I think, contributes to those different ways of considering wages and money, right? Saving versus spending immediately. You're going to be more willing to spend immediately if you get paid on the daily versus if you get paid every 2 weeks or every month or whatever.
Count all of the breaks and meal times and nap times, that might translate into 8 hours of actual work. And that was on the busy end of the spectrum. At other times, a shortened workday would often lead to less than 4 hours of actual work. That all began to change with the proliferation of mechanical clocks. Cities and towns began building clock towers in their town squares. In the late 14th...
Yeah, I mean, this change, it's partially... Because he's talking about the change from sort of a medieval to a modern economy. There's a lot of things that go into it. And he's going to talk, I'm sure he's going to talk about the hours we work and how they're counted and all that sort of stuff. There's a lot of changes there. But one is, once again, simply sort of a practical change of if you have more clocks and timepieces around, you can literally just tell the time more easily and tell the time more precisely. And so prior to this, it just wouldn't have been possible to have those sort of regimented, what's what I'm looking for, same everyday work hours, these stable work hours every day. But when you have clocks, and you have clocks in more places, and watches, and pocket watches, it becomes possible to have consistent, that's what I'm looking for, more consistent working hours.
And early 15th centuries. And before too long, churches, and yes, even some private businesses, were inspired to have mechanical clocks of their own. Arguably, the most important clock ever built was installed at the Amsterdam Stock Exchange in 1611. The Netherlands were at the epicenter of this new capitalism fad that was sweeping Europe. And
they were. I mean, if you're talking about the development of especially early capitalism, England is always in the conversation. And if you're talking about the development of capitalism overall, they're going to be the main country you're looking at. But if you're looking especially at the development of sort of early capitalism and markets and stuff like that, you're going to look at the Netherlands as well. especially with their early and rather advanced stock market, right? So they're a big player in this process, especially early on. And like I said, the English as well. But I was going to say, the English, they learn a fair amount of this from the Dutch, right? So there's a lot going on here.
Their shiny new stock exchange reflected that. Local Dutch governments tried to curb the capitalist fervor taking over their country by restricting stock trading to certain times of day. 2 hours in the summer and 30 minutes in the winter.
Oh, wow.
Wait a second. See that? Even as late as 1611, Dutch stock traders had their own version of winter wages. It didn't even necessarily make sense for their job. It was just in the culture that that's what people did in the winter. Anyways, the Dutch wanted to issue hefty fines to any traders who violated these restrictions. So the stock exchange commissioned a giant state-of-the-art clock. This idea quickly proliferated to every stock exchange in Europe. And with this, the clock escaped the public realm of town squares and entered the private realm of business. All of a sudden, capitalists wanted to prove how much of a capitalist they were by having their place of business install a mechanical clock.
Yeah, and I mean, the mechanical clock is obviously, we're talking rather early in this process, but if you want to think about sort of timekeeping and capitalism and industry, I mean, this is a topic you could really dig into this. There's so much work done on industrialization and capitalism and all that sort of stuff, and I'm not an expert on it, but there's a whole host of reading that could be done. But I think of, say, the 18 into 1900s, where you get this, I forget what it's called, but you get these methods of, building factories, industrializing, you get this sort of factory floor, and you will time people, right? Time them minute by minute, and that becomes very popular in that era. Of course, the later invention of the assembly line streamlines things even more, but, timekeeping is actually a fairly big part of this. And there's sort of a word for this movement within industrial capitalism. There's a name for it that I'm forgetting, but it is particularly in that mid-late 1800s into 1900s. But as you can see, this is something that you can talk about much earlier on in the process.
Just like their local stock exchange. Clock mania had begun. Textile mills were the first businesses utterly transformed by the clock. Some brain genius had the idea to connect the mechanical clock to a...
Right, and if we look, by the way, at the development of industrial capitalism, textile manufacturing is one of those early industries that really kicks everything off, right? You're talking about the development of early capitalism and industrial capitalism in particular. You're going to be looking at textile mills, textile factories in England. So this is sort of a big part of that story.
Bell, which would signal the beginning and the end of the workday. This was a profound cultural shift, and workers really struggled to make sense of it. Understandably, under the old system, and by the old system I mean the way that people have been working for all of human history, workers were hired by the day and measured the day in 30-minute chunks. They began and ended their workday accordingly within a broad 30-minute window. Now, workers were hired by the hour and measured the day in 60-second chunks.
And I will reiterate once again, there is a lot of literature on this topic. I mean, a lot of literature on the topic of capitalism, but also capitalism and timekeeping. We saw E.P. Thompson sort of writing a bit about it there. So we're only going to scratch the surface of this, and this is not a literature that I am super familiar with. Just know, this is one of those topics that you can go incredibly deep on, and there have been countless academic debates and conversations for decades on this topic. So there is really an incredible amount of really anything about the topic of capitalism. There's an incredible amount of academic literature from a whole host of different disciplines. It's an extremely complicated topic, and that includes the more specific subtopic of capitalism and timekeeping.
This was new, and it was confusing. Many workers responded to the workday bell by doing the most logical thing under the circumstances.
Ignoring
they just
it?
ignored it. It had never mattered before
Yep.
at precisely what minute
I
one
feel ya.
began or ended their work. So why should it matter now? But the capitalists cared. In fact, they would develop an unhealthy obsession with the clock. Before too long, the capitalists were able to convince city governments to get involved, who began issuing fines to workers who were late for the workday bell. Let me say this again. If a worker who worked for a private business
that's crazy.
was 1 minute late for work, the local government would fine them as much as an entire day's pay.
That's actually crazy. So that's something that we've eased off on a little bit. Can you imagine that? Showing up even a little late to work. And, I mean, it depends on your workplace. Some workplaces are more chill. Some are more strict about something like that. I think a lot of us showing up a minute or two, it wouldn't be a big deal. But can you imagine showing up late and not only being chastised by your employer, but being fined by the local government? I mean, that is crazy.
This kind of thing.
But this also represents an era, as we're moving into 16, 17, 1800s, when, the constituency of government, well, maybe I shouldn't say the constituency, the elites who actually run government, right, let's be honest, is moving away from your sort of medieval feudal lord types and towards a more sort of capitalist bourgeois class, whether it be merchants or business owners or, at certain points, plantation owners, right? We're talking about a moneyed class who is beginning to more control the government. Their influence is growing, and we see that sort of collaboration in something like this.
Had never been done before. It had never been part of the unwritten contract between bosses and workers. The capitalists just invented this new rule out of whole cloth, and they did it by joining hands with local governments across Europe. Industrial capitalism and the heavy hand of government. Friends since the very beginning.
True.
The owners of the textile mills wanted...
That is very true. I see the point he's making, which is, we have a lot of talk about sort of the free market and capitalism today, right? A lot of talk about keeping government out of markets. But, if you actually understand the economy, you'll understand that the free market is only propped up by governments. And that all of this is only here in the first place due to government intervention, right? Capitalism, industrial capitalism, there has been a strong partnership from the beginning between sort of private individuals, business owners, capitalists, and government institutions and governments themselves. So that's something worth pointing out.
To change the culture of work. And they did. But they did it by basically beating their workers into submission. As capitalism and later industrialization swept across Europe, it brought with it an oppressive, even authoritarian relationship between workers and owners. Shortly after the introduction of the clock, the capitalist class killed the customary afternoon nap that had been part of the workday for as long as people could remember. Absolutely tragic. They also stopped providing food to the workers, which dumped an extra financial burden onto the working class. Mealtimes, which up until now had been long and informal and subsidized by the employer, were shortened and regulated down to the minute. The entire workday was just squeezed and squeezed until...
Yeah, we see the formation of our modern workday, right? Trying to squeeze more profit out of the same number of hours, right? No matter how hard you work, there's only 24 hours in a day, and you're only going to get your employees into the workplace for a certain amount of those hours, so you need to squeeze those hours for as much labor as possible. And of course, this also is alongside industrialization, urbanization, getting everybody squeezed into these cities and then into these factories where you can more easily control a large number of people. Well, maybe I shouldn't say more easily, but you can control and influence a large number of people in one place. Now, of course, that also leads to sort of class consciousness and workers banding together in big numbers and eventually making unions and labor action So it's a two-sided story, but, all of this lines up with that process as well.
All of the air and all of the culture and all of the joy was taken out of it. But soon, even having a maximally productive workday wasn't enough.
Whoa.
Workers quickly figured out that they could not trust the company clock. Many bosses liked to fiddle with the time so that the workday started a little bit too early.
That's nefarious.
And ended a little bit too late. One trick that bosses liked to pull with early company clocks was to rig them to the production line so that if there was any sort of technological problem, as there often was, then the clock would stop.
Wow.
Later generations of company clocks had mechanisms built into them that caused them to periodically pause during the workday, accumulating minutes,
That is really nefarious.
only to suddenly jump forward to the real time during breaks. It's funny, because the capitalists were the ones that invented this idea that the clock must reign supreme. They were the ones who had the government fine people if they were 1 minute late for work. They were the ones who unilaterally imposed this new social contract on workers. And then they were the ones to immediately break this new social contract.
It's interesting to talk about it as a social contract, right? Because we often talk about a social contract between a citizenry and their government, right? Going back to some of our two most famous contract theorists, Locke and Hobbes. My goodness. These two are often seen as diametrically opposed, and in some ways they are, but they both worked within the framework of contract theory, so, you can view them that way as well. We often talk about contract theory, social contracts between citizenry and the government. Here we're talking about contract theory, social contracts between workers and their employer, which I think is an interesting and fair way to talk about it, because if you think about it, your employer may be a private organization, or maybe a public one, a company or corporation, but we're essentially talking about the members of that corporation and the governance, how that organization is run, right? I mean, a government is, you get into a whole lot of theory here, like libertarian theory and all this sort of stuff. But the government, in some ways, is just sort of the biggest company, the biggest corporation. So big it becomes public, right? In some ways, the governance structures between the two are not so different. There are obvious differences between a public government and a private company, different issues they have to deal with. But I don't think it's wrong to talk about the relationship between workers and their employer as some sort of social contract, though it's of course different than the contract between a government and a citizenry.
Why? No reason, really, just for a few extra bucks. Like I said, workers caught on pretty quickly, but when workers talked with other workers about how the company clock was inaccurate, it became standard practice within the textile industry to fire them on the spot. Fast forward 200 years.
Whoa.
When pocket watches became common, workers did the sensible thing and brought them to work. Why wouldn't they? The capitalists had established long ago that being even 1 minute late for work was a mortal sin. Surely pocket watches would enable workers to be supernaturally punctual. This was exactly what the bosses wanted, right? But that's not how it went. For the first time ever, workers with pocket watches had physical proof that their bosses were tampering with the clocks. This practice was so egregious and so morally wrong that it became a political scandal, particularly in Britain, with genuine calls for regulation and reform. The capitalists responded to this scandal by, well, what do you think they did? Imagine, you own a factory, you find out your middle managers are messing with the company clock. Word gets out, there are angry newspaper columns, there are debates in parliament, there's the threat of legislation coming down on your head, there is a full-blown political scandal. What do?
Well, you could imagine a smart response, which is sort of fixing the problem on your own initiative to avoid regulation. Maybe that. I could also imagine just firing the employees who speak out.
If you said, ban pocket watches from factories, search workers before they enter the building, and fire anybody who complains about it, then congratulations, you're a fascist. And yeah, that's exactly what the capitalists did.
That's funny.
By now, it should be clear that the mechanical clock was a tool used by the industrialists to subjugate and exploit their workers. It was never about productivity or efficiency, because they proved over hundreds of years that they would rather fire a productive worker than run an accurate company clock. That was where their priorities were. It was never really about profits, was it? It was about power.
I mean, profits are power. I mean, in the sort of world we live in, right? That money equals power. So, I mean, it's about profits, but to maintain your operation and maintain those profits in the way you want to, you're going to exercise power in firing anyone who speaks out. So, you know, it's about both profit and power. And on the topic of productivity, you know, something I like to point out is you can look at a graph of productivity of the individual worker in the United States, right? It's continued to go up over time. Partially due to harder working and partially due to technological advancements. But in the US, wages have not followed that increase, right? Especially nominal if we account for inflation. Wages have essentially been flat in this country for decades, right? Wages do not keep up with inflation over time, or they just barely keep up, right? You're either talking about decreased nominal, or real wages, I should say, or flat real wages. And that's with that increase in productivity, right? So the relationship for the worker between productivity and wages, at least at this point in American history, because that's what I'm familiar with, there is not a relationship between productivity and wages. Your productivity can go up, but your real wages will stay flat.
20th century Canadian socialist George Woodcock, who wrote at length about what he called the tyranny of the clock, wrote the following. And because, without some means of exact timekeeping, industrial capitalism could never have developed and could not continue to exploit their workers, the clock represents an element of mechanical tyranny in the lives of modern men, more potent than any other exploiter or any other machine.
I mean, it's a big claim, you know. I'd have to really dig into it, think about it. I don't know if I'd say more than any other exploiter, but, you know, what I would say is that, as I've talked about, there's a lot of literature on this, and sort of the development of modern timekeeping and capitalism, industrial capitalism, are very closely linked. So there absolutely is a relationship there, right? That modern timekeeping, clocks, etc., that is a big part of the development of modern industrial capitalism.
All of the trends that began with the mechanical clock kicked into overdrive with the widespread adoption of artificial lighting. This is what finally killed winter wages.
Right.
Now, there was no need to take it easy when the days were short. With artificial lighting, capitalists started treating every season like...
Well, this is what I was talking about earlier. You know, you're an agricultural laborer in, I don't know, like the 1400s. You're not going to be working past dark because there's no way to effectively light the fields. You know, you can't see what you're doing. And so when days are short, you're going to go home. But with artificial light, I guess we might be talking about like oil lamps and then electric lighting. You know, with this sort of lighting, it becomes possible to light up, especially a space like a factory. And thus, you don't need to work around the natural event of the sun rising and falling. You can work independently of that. Right? And so once again, we're moving towards our sort of consistent daily hours, which today tend to be 8 hours for 5 days out of the week. Of course, if we're talking about an earlier era of industrial capitalism, it might be more like 12, 14, 16 hours a day, right? But you can get those more consistent and longer hours.
Like it was harvest season. That's how factory workers got stuck working 12, 14, 16-hour shifts. Not just during the busy season, but all year long.
Right.
That familiar feeling where you leave work in the winter and it's already dark out, That wasn't a thing until like 1802. That was a thing that was invented by industrial capitalists in order to maximize productivity. The industrial capitalists did not stop with the tyranny of the mechanical clock, and they did not stop with the 12, 14, or even 16-hour workday. In time, they expanded their reign of terror to target public holidays.
Whoa.
Within a matter of decades, public holidays that had existed for hundreds of years were systematically suppressed in favor of more work.
Oh, man.
We talked earlier about the late medieval period, when workers were able to live lives where they had 42%, 49%, 51% of days off. Only 200 or 300 years later, workers had to learn to survive with only 15% of days off.
You know, it's funny, one of the things this reminds me of is when English settlers made their way to the Americas, right? I'm more familiar with that than, say, the Spanish colonists or the French colonists, right? I know more about the English colonists in particular. They make their way to the Americas in the 1600s, and this is an era in England when things are sort of rapidly beginning to develop, right? You have the beginnings of sort of a modern capitalism, the rise of markets, the enclosure of public lands, right? Everything becoming private property. Some of these changes are very much in flux, and I think especially a lot of those colonists who go to the New World sort of embrace a lot of these new changes of sort of early capitalism. And so some of the notes you'll get from English colonists on the indigenous people, 16 into 1700s, is they'll make comments about how the indigenous people, they don't work as hard as us, they're lazy, etc., etc. These sort of very judgmental comments and notes. But what it was is that the indigenous people, right, sort of similar to some of the stuff we're talking about, and in this case, we're talking about the English colonists, we're talking about indigenous people in sort of the mid-Atlantic and eastern United States. A lot of them sort of worked as much as they needed to, and then spent their time doing other activities, right? That's sort of how this culture in particular worked. And, you know, the people of that region also had a very effective farming technique, right, of planting your corn, your beans, and your squash, and that they sort of all worked together, versus the English who came over trying to use their sort of European farming techniques. They struggled a lot. So the indigenous people had this fairly well-working farming system. They hunted, they did what they needed to, and then with their extra time, they attended to other activities, right? And so we do see some of that split even in a story like that.
The industrial capitalists would have taken more if they could, but the church mounted a defense of Sunday as a day off, mostly. At the end of it all, the lives of workers had been completely transformed.
And we see there is sort of an anti-religious element in a lot of these sort of modern, liberal, bourgeois type governments. You can think of like the French revolutionaries. Some of them were pretty anti-religious. Maybe some were more pro-religious toleration, but something like the French Revolution, some of those guys were pretty anti-Catholic explicitly. And so they wanted to get rid of a lot of these holidays. And these holidays were almost all religious in nature, right? So there's this sort of attack on the church. But additionally, right, think of a lot of these sort of liberal leaders and revolutionaries, etc. These are all sort of middle-class bourgeois individuals, right? They are sort of the new capital-owning class. It's these types of people. And so along with this attack on religion from maybe a sort of ideological perspective, it's also a way to make their workers work more days, right? So it's all sort of, you see how it's all tied up, the rise of capitalism, modernization of these governments, centralization, the rise of these ideologies and liberalism and all this sort of stuff. It's a complicated process, but that's also part of it. And so in some ways, an old institution, conservative, traditional, like the church, not often, but at some points will step up to defend something like workers' days off, because it's also a religious thing. They say, hey, wait a minute, you're trying to take all these religious days away, but, we need these to celebrate our particular holidays or events or whatever.
Transformed. English workers in the 19th century were working 80% more than English workers in the 17th century. The country had never been richer, but
Wow.
you would never know it by looking at the workers. Over the century leading up to this, the British GDP had grown by 50%. But over the same period, worker pay was not just stagnant, but in decline. They were doing almost double the work for less pay.
There is also, this sort of thing of GDP and gross output, and in a sort of modern capitalist economy, you expect, this is the meme, right? The line goes up, the stock market goes up, the GDP goes up. You're expecting more productivity, more growth, etc., etc. But this is unusual, right? This has not been the case throughout history. This is not how things worked, right? You were running a company, a farm, even a country throughout a lot of history. You were not necessarily expecting continued growth, right? Say you're the medieval king collecting your taxes. You might like more tax money, and you can sort of raise taxes to squeeze more money out, but you're not necessarily expecting more productivity or more economic growth. Or a lot of these ideas are fairly modern type inventions as you get, sort of economists and liberalism and the Enlightenment and cameralism, which is a particular sort of branch of that enlightened liberal philosophy that was popular in the German states and focused a lot on economic productivity, output, and how that interplayed with running a state, right? To run a state effectively and have economic growth. These are some relatively modern ideas, and so this is something that you didn't necessarily see throughout a lot of history, at least on sort of a grand scale, right?
And the transformation wasn't just in the number of hours worked. Owners and bosses used their leverage to force their workers to live in a tiny authoritarian world run by capitalists. This shift in the culture of work has always been fascinating to me, and so I tried to look back to where it first began. When and why did we shift from the more casual and laid-back work culture that came out of medieval Europe to the more totalizing and authoritarian and inhuman work culture that came out of the Industrial Revolution? I think I've figured out where things started to shift.
Oh.
And I think I've got it pinned down to the exact year.
Wow.
1664.
Okay. I will say, no historical trend can really be pinned down to a specific year. This is a much broader movement, but I'm interested to see how he decided on this year.
In 1664, some absolutely psychotic capitalist named Richard Palmer, cursed be his name, paid the church in the town of Wokingham, England, to ring their bell.
Wokingham. Guys, this is the woke mind virus, truly. Oh, I'm so stupid.
At precisely 4 o'clock every morning, and at precisely 8 o'clock every evening. He did this because he was still seeing the cultural evidence of winter wages, where workers woke up later during the slow winter months and worked half as hard as they normally did. As a capitalist, this drove Palmer crazy. He felt that it was deeply important for workers to be up 4 hours before sunrise every day.
And so this is one of those moments, I talked about a little earlier, how sometimes churches would stand up for their parishioners. This is one of those moments when a church decided not to stand up and to take the money to work with Palmer here. Though, it's complicated. It depends on the local church. But during this era, the sort of industrializing capitalist era, churches could be a real center of community among the working class. They could even be places for organizing of labor activity. But then again, they could also not be, right? It depends where exactly you're looking at, which church, and which community, etc., etc.
Even if they didn't really have any work to do. If they didn't want to wake up on their own, he would do it for them. So he had the church bell ring at 4 o'clock every morning, 4 hours before sunrise. He also felt that it was his job to tell people when to go to bed. So he had the church bell ring at 8 o'clock every evening. Also, shout out to this church for straight up abandoning their religious mission and surrendering to this capitalist weirdo. Way to go, guys. I hope the money was worth it.
Damn.
According to Richard Palmer and this new breed of 17th century capitalist coming up with him, private time was an outdated concept. This new generation of capitalists wanted a say in how workers were spending their hours at home. They even wanted a say in what time they went to bed. They had a totalitarian worldview. As far as they were concerned, all time was company time. Inspired by the work of Richard Palmer, this particular form of abuse became a fashionable trend in England. Psychopaths all across the country started co-opting churches and victimizing towns, all in the name of productivity. 20th century Canadian socialist George Woodcock writes of this new breed of capitalist. The new capitalists, in particular, became rabidly time conscious. Time, here symbolizing the labor of workers, was regarded by them.
Time is money, right? This famous saying. In this case, time is labor.
Almost as if it were the chief raw material of industry. But this newfound obsession with time and productivity didn't stop there. When this new generation of capitalists left their places of business, they would see their workers getting off work for the day. And what did they see them doing? Standing around in groups, chatting, relaxing on public benches, walking into public houses to grab a meal, or, God help us, a drink. All of this public recreation.
Right, and I will say, this sort of crusade from the bosses against public recreation for their employees, this is a crusade that would continue through the years. Right, this is also something that was pretty common to the 19th century as well.
Bothered Palmer and his friends immensely. Palmer's obsession with the clock coincided almost exactly with the rise of English newspapers. And what did this first generation of newspapers like to discuss? They liked to discuss the problem of the poor, and specifically the problem of the leisure activities of the poor. The capitalists were very open about this. They said that the only legitimate leisure activities for the poor were mental cultivation or religious study. Basically,
right, and like I said, this is something that would continue, and the problem of the poor, this was a big topic at the time, and before and after this time. In fact, one of the first sort of serious colonization pitches to the English crown included a lot of stuff about how, London and England is becoming crowded with the destitute, the poor, the vagrants. We need another place to send them so they can be productive and work, and that can be our American colonies, right? This was sort of an early colonization pitch. So you can see this was a popular topic, popular concern of the, writing and reading classes at the time.
Studying Latin or studying the Bible, that's what poor people should be allowed to do for fun. Anything other than that, they argued, was corrosive to the culture. For those keeping track at home, bribing the church and turning it into a private tool for the capitalist class, not corrosive to the culture. Relaxing on a public bench after work, corrosive to the culture. These people were demons. That's what the capitalists wanted. No life outside of work, no hobbies, no idleness, no relaxation.
Yeah, well, a big sort of phrase was drunken idleness, right? This is what they really didn't like, and this would continue to be, like I said, a topic of contention through the years, especially into the early 1900s, right? You had a real movement in a lot of countries, America, Britain, etc., against bars and saloons and drinking and all this sort of stuff. Of course, in the United States, we ended up with prohibition. Now, that's not entirely about this whole topic of work, right? There was a whole lot more to it, but, there's part of that there.
No days off. Nothing to look forward to. No life. Just work and someone else's profit. 20th century Canadian socialist George Woodcock
Historia Civilis, he loves this guy.
Concedes that mechanical time is valuable as a means of coordination of activities in a highly developed society. just as the machine is valuable as a means of reducing unnecessary labor. But, he argued, the modern use of the mechanical clock did not reduce unnecessary labor. It did the opposite. Hurried meals, the regular morning and evening scramble for trains or buses, the strain of having to work to time schedules, all contribute to digestive and nervous disorders, to ruin health and shorten life.
Well, it's just like, most new technologies I wouldn't label as inherently bad or anything. I don't think anyone's going to argue that timekeeping is an inherently bad thing. I mean, living today, I couldn't imagine living without exact times, these days digital around me, though maybe that's just a consequence of growing up as we did in a society that works this way. But like any technology, right, it's just how you use it, right? Is the technology used for good or bad? How's it used? Who's it used by? Who has control of it, right? I'm not usually one to brand technology as, like I said, inherently bad, even if in the long term it has negative effects. It's really about, how it's used and who it's used by. Which, to be fair, I'm not saying that, George here or Historia Civilis are arguing that timekeeping is bad. I don't think they are. I'm making that point for myself.
What to make of all this? We are richer as a society than ever before, but somehow we are less free. Workers have lost so much, not just our afternoon naps and our holidays, but our autonomy, our dignity. In short, we work too much.
I want my nap back.
But it doesn't have to be this way.
Whoa.
Medieval French peasants took as much time off as they could afford, which for them was 49% of the year. It's time for us to start moving back in that direction. We already...
Yeah, I will say you see some movement towards that. Some companies are doing this, and you see some attempts at doing this with different local governments in different places. You see some places trying out a 36-hour work week or a 4-day work week, or essentially a reduced work week where you're either having a couple hours off or maybe a day off or whatever from the usual sort of 40-hour, 5-day-a-week work week. So, I mean, there is some movement in some places towards this, though I'm not sure how widespread it'll end up being.
We know how to do this. We have the money. We have the policies. We have the administrative capacity. We have everything we need to work less. The only thing we lack is the ambition.
Whoa. It's a call to action. And the last ending song. Da-da-da. Alright, I was gotta let it play through a little bit. I always love his classic ending song. He had a bit of a call to action at the end there. This is definitely Historia Civilis' most ideological video. His most openly political. I mean, it wasn't like partisan, but I mean, come on, watching it, you can tell what perspective he's coming from. What I will say on that ending call to action is just the only way as a worker you're ever gonna get anything done is to organize, right, with unions. That's sort of how you build labor power. This is something especially relevant in the United States, where I believe around 10% of our workforce is part of a union, which is extremely low. In other countries, you'll see much, much higher percents. A fair amount of countries, a majority of workers are in unions. Some places it's even much higher than that. Some places it's low. In the US, it's particularly low. So, if you want to accomplish anything as a worker, earn back any of your time, wages, etc., etc., then you need a union. You need to organize, essentially. So, that's what I would say on that last call to action. So yeah, this was a really interesting video. Like I said, his most openly ideological video. I don't think that's a bad thing. So it's all right to have a perspective, to work through an ideological lens, right? Especially if it's clear that you're doing so, right? Everybody understands where you're coming from. But I thought that was an interesting video. I'm curious to see what all the comments are on this one. But yeah, I enjoyed this one. If you want to check it out, I've got it linked down below. If you enjoyed my reaction, I'd appreciate a like, a subscribe. I've got my Patreon links down below, so hey, go check that out to support the channel. With all that, I hope all you guys are having a good day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.